Here's a number that should stop you cold. In Iran right now, the price of solid vegetable oil has surged by 375% compared to 1 year ago. Chicken is up 191%. Imported rice has more than tripled. And the Iranian Rial has collapsed to 1.8 million per US dollar, an all-time record low. These are not estimates. These are figures published this week by the Statistical Center of Iran and confirmed by Al Jazeera, Fortune, and the IMF. You are watching Global Sketch if you want the most data-driven, fact-verified breakdown of what is actually happening inside Iran's economy right now. Subscribe immediately, because what we are about to walk through goes far deeper than headlines. The human cost of this crisis is staggering, and the numbers behind it are even more so. Let us begin with the official government data, because even Iran's own statistical agencies are now publishing figures that describe a crisis of historic proportions. The Statistical Center of Iran, the government's own data body, reported on May 2, 2026, that food inflation for March and April of this year reached 115% compared to the same period 1 year ago. Let that number land. Not 15%, not 25%, 115%. That means the average Iranian family is now paying more than double what they paid for food just 12 months ago. Point-to-point inflation for all goods and services was reported at 73.5%, meaning even outside of food, every basket of goods and services costs nearly 3/4 more than it did a year ago. The annual inflation rate sits at 53.7% according to the Statistical Center, while the Central Bank of Iran, which uses a different methodology and dataset, reported a slightly lower figure of 67% for the first month of the Iranian New Year compared to the same month last year, along with a 7% monthly increase in a single month alone. Both agencies, measuring differently, arrive at the same conclusion. Iran is experiencing one of the highest inflation rates on the planet. The IMF's World Economic Outlook, published in April 2026, projects Iran's inflation rate will approach 68.9% for the full year of 2026. The same report projects Iran's economy will contract by 6.1% in 2026, a full recession, with no recovery projected until 2027. Iran's Vice President Mohammad Reza Arif admitted publicly that prices for certain products surged by more than 100% in less than a single week. This is not opposition analysis. This is the Iranian government's own senior officials making these admissions on the record. Now let us move from the headline inflation numbers down to the specific food items, because this is where the crisis becomes impossible to abstract away. These figures come directly from the Statistical Center of Iran's latest report, confirmed by Al Jazeera's reporting on May 10, 2026. Solid vegetable oil, up 375% year-on-year. Liquid cooking oil, up 308%. Imported rice, up to 109%. Domestically grown Iranian rice, up 173%. Chicken, up 191%. Even the items with the lowest price increases on the list tell a story of crisis. Butter is up 48%. Infant formula is up 71%. Pasta is up 75%. To put these numbers in human terms, a family that was spending a standard monthly grocery budget on cooking oil 1 year ago is now spending 4 to 5 times that amount on the same product. Cooking oil is not a luxury. It is a basic caloric input for every meal prepared in an Iranian kitchen.
Just last month I was still able to afford some basic items, but now those same products are out of reach. Prices keep rising while salaries stay the same, and it's not only me, many people across society are struggling.
Before, 3 out of every 5 customers would order food. Now only 2 do, and many of them share a single meal to cut costs. At the same time, we can't increase prices either.
Prices are rising every day. I believe part of these increases is being driven by panic in the markets and speculation. Products like vegetables and meat are already far more expensive than they were just a few days ago.
We've already adjusted our prices 3 times. The cost of liver alone has more than doubled. When we ask suppliers why, they blame shortages or say livestock is being exported. The truth is, there seems to be very little oversight.
When cooking oil more than quadruples in price while wages remain flat, the entire food security of a household collapses. State-run agencies in Iran have acknowledged the scale of the problem. The Consumers and Producers Protection Organization sent a directive to governors across all 31 of Iran's provinces on Sunday, May 10th, declaring that new price hikes for cooking oil are, in their words, illegal and must be returned to previous price levels. The directive provided no mechanism for how that would actually be enforced. Prices continued to rise. Every food crisis in Iran right now flows back to one underlying variable: the collapse of the Iranian Rial. And the numbers here are historically unprecedented. As of this week, the Rial is trading at 1.8 million per US dollar in unofficial markets, a fresh all-time record low. To understand how catastrophic that is, consider the trajectory. In March 2019, the exchange rate passed 1 million Rial per dollar, at the time considered an economic emergency. By January 2026, it had reached 1.1 million. Since the start of the current military conflict in February 2026, the Rial has lost an additional significant portion of its value. The currency fell 8% in the first month and a half of the war alone, and has continued weakening since. Iran's central bank has responded by issuing ever larger currency denominations. It printed a 10 million Rial note just 1 month after introducing the 5 million Rial note into circulation, a classic signal of accelerating monetary distress. Bank withdrawal limits have been imposed, reflecting severe financial system strain. The minimum monthly wage in Iran, even after a proposed 20% increase, converts to approximately $104 US dollars at current exchange rates. The average income for working Iranians has contracted to roughly $100 per month. Meanwhile, independent economists estimate that the urban poverty line for a family has reached over 550 million Rials, figure more than 3 times the minimum wage. The food crisis did not begin with the 2026 war, but the war has turbocharged it at a speed that has overwhelmed every existing coping mechanism Iranian households had developed before the conflict began in February 2026. Iran's annual food inflation was already running at 105% as of February. According to Iran International, general inflation had reached 47.5% on the eve of hostilities. The Rial had already lost more than 20% of its value in less than 20 days during late 2025. The country entered the war economically fragile and emerged from the initial conflict period in a state of acute food system stress. The U.S. naval blockade on the Strait of Hormuz has been particularly devastating for food supply chains. More than 90% of Iran's international trade passes through the strait. Oxford Economics has estimated that the blockade could cut off 70% of Iran's export revenues. The IMF calculates the blockade imposes approximately $13 billion in monthly economic damage when export losses and disrupted imports are combined. Iran is a significant food importer. Disrupting the strait does not just affect oil. It affects every container ship carrying grains, cooking oils, and imported goods that Iranian households depend on. The war also directly destroyed productive infrastructure. Military strikes damaged industrial facilities, disrupting supply chains at the production level. Iran's internet blackout, imposed domestically and partially by infrastructure damage, has disrupted the digital commerce and logistics systems that urban food distribution increasingly depends on. 2 million jobs have been lost since February 2026, according to reporting by The National. The IMF projects a 6.1% GDP contraction for 2026. State media has estimated reconstruction costs at approximately $270 billion, roughly 80% of Iran's entire pre-war GDP of $341 billion. The most acute dimension of this crisis is not the inflation rate itself, it is the gap between inflation and wages. And that gap in Iran right now is one of the widest of any country tracked by international economic institutions. Iran's government proposed a 20% wage increase in its budget for the Persian year 1405, roughly March 2026 through March 2027. The government's own spokesperson, Fatima Mohajerani, said publicly that any wage increase above 20% would itself be inflationary. Here's the problem with that argument. Food inflation is running at 115%. A 20% wage increase covers less than 1/5 of food inflation. Workers are mathematically guaranteed to fall further behind with every passing month. Independent analysts have noted that the minimum cost of living basket for a working-class family, housing, food, healthcare, and transportation now requires over 550 million Rials per month. The minimum wage is set at approximately 156 million Rials. That gap between 156 million and 550 million Rials is not a marginal difference. It represents the difference between survival and chronic poverty. More than 60% of Iranian workers reportedly hold multiple jobs. In an attempt to close that gap, it is not closing. The food inflation rate is accelerating faster than any combination of wages, and second jobs can compensate for. Daily caloric intake per person in Iran has already fallen below 2,100 calories, the international benchmark for extreme food poverty. According to data from Iran's own Parliamentary Research Center, red meat consumption in Iran has fallen by 40% over the past decade. Dairy consumption has fallen by 30%. These are not projections. They are documented trends in what people are actually eating, showing that food insecurity was already deeply embedded before the current crisis intensified. The Iranian government has not been silent about the crisis, but the gap between its stated responses and their actual effectiveness has itself become part of the story. The government has implemented price control directives, subsidy mechanisms, and official exchange rates intended to cushion essential imports. The Consumers and Producers Protection Organization has issued binding instructions to provincial governors demanding price rollbacks. None of these measures have successfully arrested the price surge. Suppliers have continued to raise prices, citing raw material costs, currency devaluation, import disruptions, and what traders and business owners describe as a near-complete absence of enforcement capacity on the ground. State television and outlets linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have publicly described the price surges as an economic revenge campaign orchestrated by enemies, a framing designed to attribute domestic economic failures to external actors. Government officials have urged citizens not to be deceived by enemy-made price hikes. The economic data does not support that framing as the primary explanation. Structural factors, currency collapse, import disruption, decades of mismanagement, sanctions, and the direct economic impact of military conflict are the primary drivers identified by the IMF, Oxford Economics, and independent analysts. The government is also facing a budget crisis of extraordinary proportions. Iran's Parliamentary Budget Commission has reported a government budget deficit, estimated at 1,800 trillion tomans. High inflation has forced the central bank to print money to cover fiscal gaps, which in turn feeds more inflation in a self-reinforcing spiral that price control directives alone cannot interrupt. Iran's food crisis is not contained within its borders. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the disruption of regional supply chains has sent food commodity price pressures beyond Iran and across global markets. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's Global Food Commodity Price Index rose 1.6% in April 2026, driven by higher vegetable oil, meat, and cereal prices linked directly to the Iran war and Strait of Hormuz disruption. That placed global food prices at their highest level in more than 3 years. According to Bloomberg's reporting on the FAO data release dated May 8, 2026, the index is now to 0.5% above where it was 1 year ago. These are global food prices, meaning that Iranian supply chain disruption is contributing to food cost increases that shoppers in Europe, South Asia, and East Africa are experiencing at their supermarkets. The Strait of Hormuz, before the conflict, carried approximately 20% of the world's oil and gas. The IEA has characterized the disruption to strait traffic as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Energy price shocks transmit directly into food production costs through fuel for farming, fertilizer production, and cold chain logistics. The interconnection between Iran's domestic food crisis and the global food system is direct, measurable, and ongoing. Here is the forward-looking assessment that should shape how we understand the scale of this crisis. Iran's own central bank has warned President Masoud Pezeshkian in internal briefings, details of which were reported by Iran International, that rebuilding the war-damaged economy could take more than a decade. Senior economic officials placed the recovery timeline at up to 12 years. This assessment combines the pre-existing economic fragility, the direct damage from the 40-day conflict, and the ongoing impact of sanctions and blockade. State media has estimated reconstruction costs at $270 billion, a figure representing approximately 80% of Iran's entire pre-war GDP of $341 billion. The IMF projects no economic recovery until 2027 at the earliest. 2 million jobs have been lost since February 2026. Youth unemployment is documented at 19%, and over 60% of workers hold multiple jobs just to cover basic living costs. The gap between the minimum wage and the actual poverty line is more than 3.5 times wider than the wage itself. The trajectory of food inflation, from 41% in May 2025 to 58% by September 2025 to 105% by February 2026 to 115% in March and April 2026, shows acceleration rather than stabilization. External support will be limited. Reconstruction is constrained by international sanctions, restricted borrowing capacity, and a fiscal position already in deep deficit. Even in the optimistic scenario where a peace deal is reached, the rebuilding process begins from a foundation that has been severely compromised by decades of structural economic mismanagement compounded by conflict. Here is what the global sketch data analysis concludes from everything we have reviewed today. Source from the Statistical Center of Iran, the IMF World Economic Outlook 2026. The Rial has fallen to a historic low of 1.8 million per dollar. The IMF projects a 6.1% GDP contraction in 2026 with no recovery until 2027. 2 million jobs have been lost since February. Minimum wages cover less than 30% of the actual poverty line. Global food prices are at a 3-year high, partly driven by Strait of Hormuz disruption. And Iran's central bank warns recovery could take 12 years. At the center of all of these numbers are ordinary Iranian families who are cutting meals, sharing food, and watching the purchasing power of their wages evaporate week by week. The human cost of this crisis is not a footnote to the data. It is what the data is measuring. Subscribe to Global Sketch right now for this kind of weekly, source-verified, data-driven global analysis. Drop your view in the comments. What do you think is the single biggest driver of Iran's food crisis right now? We want to see the conversation. See you in the next one.